And so I think we will actually start with Alli Dixon. If you are Alli, you're
Yay, Alli!
all right, how's that look?
Looks good. So today I'll be presenting on Zora Neale Hurston, who is a Black literary figure. She was an author, and she was an author of novels, short stories, plays, and additionally a little bit of poetry that I could find. She's an important Black literary figure and has some super famous novels. One of Dr. Friend's favorites, I believe.
Their eyes were watching God.
Yep, which is her most notable work. So without further ado, next slide, please, Holden. So as Dr. Brand just said, she is most famous for her work, Their Eyes Were Watching God. And what she's most known for in her works is publishing about the experiences of Black people in fiction. So if you think about like post-Reconstruction in the 1920s when she was writing mostly, there was not a lot of fiction centering Black people and their experiences. This can be attributed to a few things, especially literacy rates and prevalence of people who had the ability to write, had the education to write, because a lot of Black people were working class jobs with little free time or accessibility to the arts and literature in specific. So she was really a pioneer in writing about Black experience, not only in like a non-fictional forum, but a fictional forum. A lot of Black people didn't have stories about themselves to read, so she was one of the first figures that did that. She was educated in African American, and Caribbean folklore. She studied at Barnard, Columbia, and Howard. It doesn't say Howard up there, but she got her BA at Howard actually. And she implemented a lot of her knowledge of these things, especially folklore, in some of her later novels, one of which will be on the next slide. And she was known for relating these topics back to their importance on the Black community of the day, which was in the 1920s and later 30s. Next slide, please, Holty. So she was also a prominent figure of this cultural movement called the Harlem Renaissance, and if you don't know what the Harlem Renaissance is, I encourage you to research it independently. It was a Black literary and arts movement centered in Harlem, New York in the 1920s. It centered a lot of Black authors, playwrights, artists, and many more, and created a community of creativity around Black people, which was one of the first of its kind. It was super, super interesting and important because, as a lot of you probably know, most creative spaces, most art spaces were dominated by white people at this time, so it's really revolutionary to have a space like this centered around Black people. It was also fueled by struggles for equality, and mind you, this was far before the Civil Rights Movement, and struggles from soldiers in segregated battalions in World War I. If you're a senior and you read Black Boy, that was something that was addressed in that book, and it was something that spurred a lot of protests and early organizational movements for civil rights, especially in areas like New York. Zora Neale Hurston was one of many Black women authors also at the forefront of this movement. That was another very cool thing about the Harlem Renaissance, is it featured a lot of Black women, and Black women specifically reflecting on their experiences as Black women, especially in their literary works, which hadn't really been focused on as much at the time. It was sparse in and of itself to see people writing fiction, writing prose about Black experience, but Black women's experience was even less so reflected on. Next slide. So some of her most important and most well-known works, obviously the first is Their Eyes Were Watching God. It's Dr. Friend's favorite novel. I think there's copies in Jeff's room. Dust Trapped on a Road, that's her autobiography. I did read a couple excerpts of it in researching this presentation. It's fantastically written. I highly recommend it. Tell My Horse, Voodoo Life in Haiti and Jamaica is one of the works in which she primarily showcases her studies on Caribbean and African American folklore, and it's a very interesting book. and has really, really cool research. The last three, to be honest, I have not read, but I did do some research on her more famous novels near the end of her career, and Five Harlem Short Stories is centered in the Harlem Renaissance, with it more focusing on her short stories and essay period of writing. So, I think the next slide is just questions. Questions? Diversity Club people, please ask questions. Yes, Dr. Fran?
I heard that for a long time her works weren't, they like went out of print and it was really hard to find them. What was it that brought her like back into popularity and back into the canon?
Yeah, I think in the 70s, Alice Walker wrote an article in Ms. Magazine about one of her works. I cannot remember the specific work, but there was an article in Ms. Magazine about her, which led to a lot of her works being republished and rediscovered, which is really cool because Ms. Magazine is a prominent feminist magazine, if you're not aware. And it was very, very important in the second wave feminist movement, which kind of, the 70s kind of coattailed. Any other questions? Okay, thanks for listening.
Thanks, Alli.